How do you go about analysing the structure? Most of this I've mentioned, but just to summarise what we've done in a more formulaic kind of way. The following questions may help you to produce the outline of a psalm. Now, please note that this is not a tick-off list, but this gives you a general approach to the kind of thing you need to do. Now, every text is different, and so you need to engage in it in a different way. First of all, and this is very important in all cases, you need to determine the literary genre or form of the psalm and work out how closely it fits to the typical pattern of that genre. So, for example, there's one of the genres of psalms is an individual lament, or a psalm of thanksgiving. Okay, a genre is a particular kind of literature. Now, are you familiar with the term genre? Form, literary form? In my car, I have 2 books of 2 different genres.
Fiction and non-fiction.
Both of them, they're in my glove box. I have a manual and a directory. Now, there's a particular genre. So a manual is a particular genre of literature. What's the purpose of a manual?
Instruction.
Yeah, just a manual, car manual. Instruction. It's not theoretical. It's not theoretical, say, about a car, but how to use. You use the manual in order to do what? So if you're going to understand the way it's arranged, and you need to understand what it's there for, its purpose or function, what's the function of a car manual? It's not just theoretical. What's its purpose? To do what? So you can operate the car, you know where things are, and if something goes wrong, you can fix the most obvious things. So let's say your battery goes flat, it shows you where the battery is. You have a flat tyre, and you're really dumb, it shows you where the tyre is. Sorry? I know, and neither are batteries. I had a car once where the battery was in the most unexpected place, and if it wouldn't have been for the manual, I'd never have found it. And then there's a street directory that I have. What's the purpose of a street directory? To get there. And if you want to understand the way it's structured, there's 2 ways of looking at any genre. You ask, what is it meant to do? And what it's meant to do, or how it's meant to, explains how it is structured. So, there's a key to understanding any piece of communication, any piece of literature, is its genre. There's certain conventions about street directories and manuals and all those kinds of things. Secondly, to help you map the surface structure, not the deep structure of the psalm, identify who is speaking to whom, about what, and how. Is it address? Anybody's addressed? Who addresses whom, or who speaks about whom or what? That's very superficial. Thirdly, I demonstrated this. Note the conjunctions and work out how they function, the function of each subordinate clause. Coordinate clauses are easy because they just follow each other. There's logical sequence or chronological sequence. But when it comes to subordinate clauses, you've got to work out how they function. They stand aside from the main thread. Fourthly, plot the patterns of formal and verbal repetition in the psalm. One of the most important devices in psalms is the repeated use of the holy name, Yahweh, the tetragrammaton. Now, because it's translated as Lord, and we're so used to it, and prayer cliches keep on saying, Lord, this, we just want you, Lord, 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 this. We overuse, we take the name of the Lord in vain, but that's not the case with Psalms. If you get a repetition of the holy name, it is significant. And we'll illustrate this in a minute, you get lists of petitions. You get, sometimes you get 7, 8, 9, 10 petitions. That's a device, a structuring device. Fifthly, locate the main breaks in the psalm from the change of address or change of form or change of subject matter to divide the psalm into a series of stanzas. What are the main parts? We did that with this one. It was, how many parts do we have this psalm? 5. Okay? Identify the poetic and literary devices used in the composition of the psalm, such as imagery, we've spoken about that. Wordplay, to see that you'd have to go to the Hebrew. Now, playing words. Now, this is very important for Hebrew because Hebrew has such a small vocabulary, which means that one word is used in many different ways. And quite often, there's playing with words. It's not just means this and that, but it means both this and that, and it might mean something else. Like, there's wordplay in the psalm we had a look at. He's anointed me with fine oil. What's the issue there? What kind of anointing do we have here? Is it secular anointing? Is it holy anointing? What kind of anointed person do we have here? Parallelism, we've spoken about inclusion and chiasm. Now, lastly, and this is going to be the hardest, determine the function of each unit in the psalm, that's each stanza, as a speech act by working out not what it means, but what it is meant to do, accomplish. Okay, now let's look at the psalm that I asked you to look at. Any question on that before? Okay, now I've given you my own translation of Psalm 6. We won't work from the Hebrew, but you'll see straight away as I go through this that most translations obscure things at a couple of different points.
Sorry, John, where is the verse? Have you given that as a handout?
No, I haven't given that as a handout. I can give it to you as a handout if you want to. Do you want it now? So if you can just run down. And get Lyndall to do it, or else can you just go up here and key in, there's the name of the person, key in John Kleinig, and then no, it's a list, and so you just scroll down, and the password is 4 1s. Okay, now, you didn't hear that. And if you did, there is a performative utterance here which is implied. Yes. But not authorised access. By the way, access, another speech act. Just the psalm as a whole. Now notice it begins straight away with the tetragrammaton, Yahweh. And remember that you couldn't use that holy name anywhere except at the temple. So in your Hebrew text, this is not pointed as Yahweh, it's pointed as Adonai, which means Lord. So it's translated as Lord, but I put it here just so that you can see something. Yahweh, do not rebuke me in your wrath nor discipline. You could also say instruct me, discipline, teach, instruct. This is practical teaching, training. Do not instruct, train, discipline me in your anger. Be gracious to me, Yahweh, for I am faint. Heal me, Yahweh, for my bones are struck with terror. My nephesh translated as soul. Do any of you know what nephesh means quite literally? That's its most abstract level. That's its second most concrete level. Most obviously it's your throat. This is my nephesh here. The second meaning is what this is used for, which is for breathing, my breath. So throat, and then it can go in two ways. It can be appetite, because that's, and particularly hunger and thirst goes that way, but it can also be then life breath. Breath, life breath, and from life breath it gets to life, and my living myself as a living, breathing person, my soul, myself. Can you see there's a whole range of possibilities there? So you can say, on its most literal level, I'm completely breathless. I've lost my breath. I'm so terror-struck that I can't breathe anymore. Now, literally, that's the phenomena of panic. Now, when you panic, you have trouble breathing. But can you see it operates at a number of different levels. My nephesh too is utterly terror-struck, while you, Yahweh, how long? That's a puzzling expression. Please turn, Yahweh, please deliver my soul. Save me because of your loving kindness, your keseth. Usually translated as steadfast love, but it's more loving kindness, generosity, mercy. For in death there is no remembrance of you. Who can give thanks to you in Sheol? That's the Greek term. It's the term for the underworld. The underworld is also the grave, the place of the dead, and it's the Old Testament term for what then is Hades, which becomes hell. But notice it's not as narrow as hell. I put Sheol, the most the clearest way of communicating that is the underworld. You get heaven, the overworld, you get this world, and then you get Sheol, which is the underworld. I am weary with groaning. Every night I flood my bed. I drench my bed mat with tears. My eyes grow weak with grief. They fail because of all my foes. Depart from me, you evildoers, for Yahweh has heard the sound of my weeping. Yahweh has heard my plea for grace. Yahweh has received my petition. Let my enemies be put to shame and utterly dismayed. Let them once again be suddenly put to shame. Now, I'm not interested in doing a detailed exegesis of this, and I'm not even interested so much in the content of this. I want you to analyse the structure of this. Is there anything here that strikes you about the structure in the light of what we've done? And you can start anywhere.
It repeats Yahweh, Yahweh, then nothing, then Yahweh, Yahweh, Yahweh again.
Righto. And how many times is Yahweh repeated?
4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Actually, it's 7 times, I think, in the Hebrew text. The English adds an extra one. But notice the repetition of the holy name, not accidental, and where they come. Joel, where do they tend to cluster?
In the first and fourth verses.
Righto, and notice that I've very easily put them into stanzas for you. Righto, it's this one, and then there is one here. Okay, it clusters there, and you can say, why does it cluster there? That's self-significant. Anything else about it?
It's a plea. It's
a plea, and it begins with the plea for help. And how far does the plea go, Joel?
The whole thing is a plea.
No, it's not.
Oh, it goes to verse 5 and then stops. And then...
Okay, just stop there, okay? All this is a plea, a petition. Now, notice that there are a number of conjunctions here. Where are the conjunctions? Anybody? No, there's one earlier than that. Notice verse 2, we have 2 fors there, which gives the reason for the request. Be gracious, why? Because I'm faint. Funny reason, unexpected reason. I'd say, be gracious because you promised to be gracious, but I'm faint. Heal me, why? My bones struck with terror, terrorized, shaken. Okay, and then where's the next connective? Is down here. And notice it gives the reason why God is to save this person. What's the reason? Because when you're dead, you can't remember God. And how do you remember God? By praising Him. Not by thinking about Him, but by praising God, you remember Him. I'm no use to you, God, as a dead person because I can't praise you anymore. Okay, now, so you get a series of pleas. How many pleas are there here? And Joel, can I stick with you?
1, 2, 3, 4. 5.
I think you've missed out a few. Look.
Be gracious.
There's 5 pleas, but then there are 2 negative pleas. Sorry, yes. And that forms how many pleas? It starts off with negatives. Don't do this, don't do that. But do. 1, 2, 3, 4,
7.
5. So there's 7. Interesting. Now, just notice the sequence of positive pleas. The first one is be gracious. The second one is heal. The third one is turn. The fourth one is deliver. Deliver, and then it culminates save. Now, if you get a series of pleas here, which ones are going to be the important ones? The first and the last are going to colour all the rest in between. But notice you get the negative ones and then you get the positive ones. Now there's also something else that stands, if we just have a look at that structurally, there is a surprise or something unexpected, something that doesn't fit in here. Do any of you identify the alien body, if you like, in that verses 1 through to 5?
Verse 5.
James, just read it for me. While you, Yahweh, and you'd expect a statement, how long? Question. Now, how does that function? Okay, how long? What do you have to do to make sense of it?
How long?
No.
Ask what is happening.
Ask what's happening. No. If I say, how long, Joel, you'd expect how to finish?
How long what?
Yeah, and what's the what going to be? Are you going to keep on doing or not doing something? You see, it's an incomplete sentence. And it's incomplete because it's left unfilled. How long? Now, what does it mean? And now, what is it, negative or positive here? How long, Yahweh, are you going to keep on doing something or not do something? Or how long before you will? There's 3 possibilities here. How long are you going to do? How long are you not going to do something? Or how long before you will do something? Which of these is intended here?
Before you will.
What? It's got all three of them. Yeah. What's the negative? How long are you going to rebuke me? Negatively. How long before what? Okay. How long before you be gracious to me? Now, how as a speech act? So those imperatives, the function's quite easy. It's a plea, it's a request, positive and negative. What's the function of this?
What separates the stanzas?
What is the function as a speech act? What is it meant to do?
Put the onus on.
It's meant to have God do what he's asking him to do in the rest of the
Okay, and if you come, think it through, that's partly right, but if you come to me, Sam, and say, Kleining, how long are you going to keep picking on me?
He wants me an answer.
Well, that's how does that function? What does it do?
Getting you to do something.
It's expressive.
It's expressive, or expresses what?
Frustration.
Frustration, but it goes stronger than that. No, it's not contractual.
Evocative.
It's evocative. You want to. It's a form of protest. You're complaining, an issue of complaint. It's a formal complaint. That's the language of complaint. Sam. Well. In some societies it's very rude, but what's interesting is that this rude language, which normally you've learnt that it's not to your advantage as students to complain to your lecturers or to complain to your wife. It doesn't usually do any good. But that doesn't mean that your frustration goes away. Can you notice that this is expressive? It expresses frustration and it issues in a formal complaint to God. Now, this is one of the most interesting features of the Psalms, is this matter of complaint, that God, unlike politicians, will do anything to avoid people complaining, and principals and lecturers at educational institutions will institutionalize stuff so that they can sideline complaints. But you get some institutions outside society, like ombudsman, where you can actually go and complain to. But what's striking here about these Psalms is that God authorizes people to do what? Complain to him. Get stuck into him. He wants this person to do it. Okay, now, where is the next basic unit in the psalm? And what does it do?
Verse 4.
That's still part of the petitions. Okay, we've dealt with 1 to 5. Okay, you have a series of pleas, and verse 3 here is you have the petitions. You get 1, 2 negatives, 2 positives, and then you get a complaint there. But there is something else that's put in here, but that follows from that there. 6 and 7. Okay? Now, I put it to you that the most important part of the psalm is verse 6 and 7, which picks up the 4s here. For I am faint, for my bones are struck with terror, and my soul, too, notice the 2 which carries it over, is utterly terror-struck. Now, what do those 4s do that is picked up here?
Instead of being petitions to God, but it's almost just a statement.
It's a statement of the psalmist. It's
Description
a description of what?
of the fools.
Of what?
I am faint because
Yes.
I am weary.
His feelings about what?
His terror,
His terror at what?
his foes.
At his foes. What's gone wrong? Something has happened to this person. This person is troubled. This is an expression or confession of the trouble that he's suffering or she's suffering. A confession, expression of the suffering. And notice it's all rather vague because it focuses on the effect of something, but you get a clue of what's gone wrong at which verse? Verse 6. But there's some other clues, okay? The enemies have done something to this person, and the result of this is that he's faint or she's faint, terrified, completely shaken to the very bones. The bones are, shaken to the core. He's weary with groaning. When do you groan? When you're in pain. Unrelieved pain. Flood with tears, bed. It's so this person is confined to bed. Drenching bed mat, eyes growing faint with grief. Righto, this is life-threatening stuff. Something's been done by the enemies that makes him bedridden and completely and totally dysfunctional. Maybe there's another dimension here that lies behind the word heal. Person's not just physically sick and shaken, but also emotionally and spiritually shaken or sick. Okay. Now, what you have here is what the part of the lament that the scholars call the actual lament. How's time going? Okay. Now, if somebody sins against you, if somebody abuses you and treats you unjustly, what's the effect of abuse?
You come downtrodden.
Okay, how do you feel?
Rubbish.
And? Angry. You feel, and that's normal. If you've sinned, you feel guilty. If you're sensitive, emotionally and spiritually. If you have been abused, treated unjustly, the natural reaction you feel hurt, that hurt will be registered in terms of anger. But notice here, there's no expression of his anger, but God's anger. It's funny here, it doesn't talk about his anger or the anger of the enemies, but of God's anger. Now, just as if you're going to deal with sin, the first thing is for you to admit your sin and to bring it out in the open. If somebody has been abused and hurt, there's usually, and you're angry, there's two ways you normally deal with your anger. What are they? Joel, you're typical of one kind of person, or no, you do both. What you do?
A violent reaction.
A violent reaction, and you lash out back. You get vengeance. You pay back. However, if a person is superior to you, if I've hurt you, what's the problem if you lash out to me?
You defeat me in words.
I've got the power. Yes, and I've got the power to squash you. Okay, and so what is the prudent thing to do always in society?
Connive.
Well, I know that's one way of dealing with it, but in terms of being passive, and what is passive? Instead of lashing out, you put the anger in. You sublimate it, you repress it. And then what's bad becomes worse and worse and worse. It festers. Now, what the laments do, not just the complaint is an extreme form of lament, is telling God two things. What's happened? Or three things. Number one, what's happened. And then secondly, how that's affected you, how you feel in the broader sense, feel physically as well as psychologically, emotionally, spiritually about what's happened. And then thirdly, you tell God as to, no, this is the negative side in the lament, who is responsible. Who's responsible in this case? God. The enemies, the foes. But notice here, the complaint isn't made to the enemies, it's made to God. And what is the effect that since this person has been abused by somebody, the anger's been repressed, and how does it affect him over against, or her over against God?
Guilt.
Not guilt. No. How has it affected him? What does he feel? And one of the things you've got to learn to do when you look at Psalms is not just to see the picture, but you've got to read the Psalms emotionally.
It feels like God's against him. Yeah.
It feels like God's against him. Which are the words? It starts off, it's right up front. What's the basic trouble? I would have expected him to start off with, my enemy's done this. This is what I feel about it. And this is, why haven't you fixed things up? Because you're supposed to be God, and this is what I want you to do. But he gets, the way he feels or experiences it is that God is siding with who? The enemies. And he's not siding with him.
Could that first verse not just simply stand alone? I'm feeling bad. I want to position God before I start asking. God, before I say anything, please don't get cross.
It has that function, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, don't get angry. I'm going to dump.
Just give me a chance to talk.
It has that function as well as anything else. Okay? It has a whole lot of different, and it's very interesting why that negative comes first. By the way, when it comes to interpretation, in most cases there is not one single right or wrong. Quite often you have a range of options. And in poetry, you get, things can function in 3 or 4 different ways. And that's one of the ways it's definitely going to function. Now, what's the next unit? Verse 8 and 9. Now, what's surprising about the jump from 7 to 8?
Who's being addressed?
He addresses the end.
Yeah, instead of addressing God and speaking about the evildoers, the enemies, the psalmist addresses the enemies, and what does he do?
Tells them to depart.
Tells them to...
Of his absolution too.
Righto? So there is some absolution here. There's a change. Something's happened between here and here, which then means that he dismisses his enemies. And what's the reason for him dismissing his enemies? Telling them to rack off? Because what? God has heard his plea. And that means he can tell the enemies to put it in Australian terms. And then you get the last part, which is very strange, and this represents what is people find most offensive in lament psalms. Okay, now what this is in Hebrew grammar is the jussive, the imperfect jussive, so it's let my enemies be put to shame and utterly dismayed. Let them once again be suddenly put to shame. Who is being addressed here? No. Notice there's no. It's not directly addressed. It's not Yahweh. But what's implied is that this is spoken to Yahweh. And what does the psalmist do? He tells God what to do. But what's the difference now, Harry, between this and this telling God what to do. You start off telling God what not to do, and then 5 things that you want him to do, and now you get a different form of expression, not imperative but adjussive. It's a wish. You tell God what you want him to do about what? Your enemies. Your enemies. Now, scholars call this imprecations. That's a fancy term, which means an expression of a prayer wish to God. Now, why isn't it put in the imperative? Because it is merely a wish. It's up to God whether he does it or doesn't do it. God has the freedom to take it up or not take it up. The best way of explaining this is something that happens these days in some courts, where you get a crime being committed against somebody. Person is tried, they're found guilty. Now, usually after a person's found guilty, what's the next thing the judge does?
Sentence.
Announces a sentence. Now, what happens in some of our courts is that something happens between the verdict and the sentence. There's a conference. What?
Impact statements and all that stuff.
Impact statements, and you get recommendations from the offended person as what they think is just punishment. And they can say, in which they can say face to face with the person, and they can recommend to the judge what they think and what they feel he needs to do. So recommendation for sentencing.
It's heavily court language.
It's court language here, and it functions as court language. Now, what's the importance of this in practical terms? Okay, can we go back through again? When you're hurt, you feel angry. You felt you've been dealt with unjustly. You want justice, justice, justice. And you want one of 2 things. Either you want to punish the person, take revenge, or you want somebody else to quarter and slaughter them. I don't know. What happens here is what happens at this point about the emotion of anger and the desire for vengeance.
Last of it out.
What?
It's almost letting the last of it out.
It's letting the last of it out.
Handing over.
Handing over the desire to do what? To have revenge. And once you've handed it over to God, you don't tell God what to do, okay? Saying, okay, may you do this, then what can't you do back? What can't you do thereafter? You can't take it back, and you can't carry it out yourself. And what this does then in terms of feeling is that it drains you of the desire for revenge and for justice. And one of the most perverse things that all of you have experienced is that you can start off with the angels when you're being offended, and you end up with the devil.
Yeah.
And it's not for negative reasons, but for positive reasons. Okay, this is the way it goes. I have been hurt. Number 2, I have been hurt unjustly. My enemy has hurt me unjustly. Therefore, I feel angry against my enemy. And the more I recycle the event, the more I remember everything else that other person ever did and said. And so the more enemy the enemy becomes. And I begin to do what about my enemy? I hate them. Hate them. And it feels good, because it means that my enemy is bad and I am good. I have the moral high ground. And I find it very hard to actually let go of the offence, because I let go of the fact, the moral high ground. But then once you're in that moral high ground, then you go on a crusade to get vindication, and you end up doing far worse to the person or to other people and to yourself than was ever done to you. Okay, now the outline of the structure that I have here. Okay. Have I given you this? No, I should have. Okay. This is my analysis of the structure. The psalm begins with 7 requests, petitions. You get negative pleas for relief from punishment, either relief from God's wrath, which has been going up to this point, or God's wrath, which will happen because you're going to get stuck into Him. You want no further rebuke or correction, no punishment. And then you get 5 positive pleas for help. There's plea for mercy, grace, because you're faint and can't help yourself, powerless. Plea for healing. Now notice the healing is both physical and mental pain. And then at this point comes the protest. This is cut in halves by the protest. Or not in half, 2 parts. Then there's the plea, and it's a strange plea. You ask God to turn. Now take it most literally, turn from where to where. And you'll find this quite frequently, and it's very often not translated because it's so strange in English. You say, God, turn, repent, shuv. Shuv means turn around. Okay, in what way? What kind of turning is being asked for here? Turning from his back to me to his face to me. Turning from being angry to being gracious, merciful. To change his attitude to me. Right? So there's the turning there. And notice that's the central one of those 5. And then there's the plea for deliverance from enemies and salvation from death. The pleas. And in that you have the complaint. And then you get the lament in verses 6 to 7, which describe the trouble. Not so much describing the trouble, the cause of the trouble, but the effect of the trouble, the suffering from the abuse or the evil that's done. 2 things are highlighted, and they both amount to the same thing. The person is so devastated that they can't even sleep at night time. They spend most of the time crying. They've lost their eyes. Now from what? With grief? From crying. They've cried themselves blind almost. That's the picture. We talk about crying their eyes out. Notice how graphic and the imagery is here. Crying their eyes out. Now some of you experienced that, and you have cried your eyes out night after night after night. Then you get the dismissal of the evildoers, the banishment of them, and what's the reason for the banishment is the Lord's answer to the pleas. And then there's lastly the prayer against the enemies. Now this is the most startling effect, the point of the psalm. We are reluctant to pray for justice for ourselves and others, and even more reluctant to pray against evil and evildoers. Now, this is a form of prayer against evildoers. Very helpful. But notice it's a wish prayer, not a formal request. So wish for recommended treatment by God. Verse 10, and it's funny, I would have expected, say, kill them, put them to death. What's the only thing that this person wants? Shaming. And this is reversed. The effect of the enemies is that this person has been utterly shamed. And so what the request for the punishment is that what was done to him by the enemy, which is the shaming, it is returned back to him. And doesn't want anything else but just to be publicly shamed. Now notice that this is not a guilt culture but a shame culture. In any shame culture, public shaming is the worst punishment. In Aboriginal society, if somebody's committed a crime, the worst kind of punishment is not to be speared or to be put in prison or even be put to death. The worst kind of punishment is public shaming, banishment. So shaming, and the worst shaming of all is not shaming by human beings, but shaming by God. Just as a little sideline here, I think we are moving here in Australia rapidly from being a guilt culture to a shame culture. And if you're going to minister to people, particularly people I'd say under the age of 30, and maybe some over, you need to minister to them in terms not of guilt, but in terms of shame, and understand what shame is, how it works, at all levels, socially, psychologically, but also spiritually. And how do you minister to people who have been shamed? There's a huge number of resources for this in the Psalms, which basically have to do with helping people who have been shamed. One last thing. The thing that strikes me most of all about this psalm is the jump from here to here. And there's two possible explanations for the jump. The one is, if you like, formal and technical, and many scholars would say this psalm was prayed at the temple, and the first part was prayed maybe not by the person but by the Levitical Levite who was acting in pastoral care, praying this psalm and to God, and then a priest would step here and give a word of assurance, a priestly oracle, and then on the basis of that you had this reaction. That's like confession absolution. There is some evidence for this, but I don't think that's so likely, and that's not the way it works anymore, because nothing's placed in here. But there's something even more profound. Why is it that the person is sure that his enemies have been dealt with and God's answered his prayer? It's because he has used the name so often, or he's called on the holy name. If you like, the use of the holy name brings with it the assurance that God will act. And if you go behind this, you'll see that there's a whole lot of promises of God that are being claimed here, which we can't go into. The psalmist here bases his requests on the promises of God and uses the holy name of God, and the very use of the holy name of God in the holy place of God, the temple, in connection with the daily sacrifices, means that God not will hear the prayer, but has heard the prayer. In the same way, when we receive the absolution, we can be sure we are forgiven, even if we don't feel forgiven. Righto, now, next time I'm going to be dealing more generally with an introduction to the Psalms. I've given you the handout there. If you want to start looking ahead, I won't go through all that data if you want to prepare for the next couple lectures.